The dust hadn't settled when the Riverview post wagon creaked to a stop. June stepped down before the driver could offer a hand, her boots hitting the dry ground with a muted thud. She didn't ask questions, just looked around, at the empty street, the boarded-up saloon, and the cracked watering trough that hadn't seen a horse in days. It wasn't what she'd expected. She adjusted her grip on the single leather case she'd packed. 5 dresses, a photograph, and one folded letter that had been read so many times it tore at the crease. Then she saw the poster. Wanted for bank robbery, his face. The same face from the photograph. The same man she'd written to, waited for. Promised to marry. A voice behind her broke the silence. "Miss, if you're looking for Silas Reed, I'm afraid you're a few weeks too late." She turned. An old man stood near the post wagon, hat in hand, eyes kind. "I'm just the post. I don't write the news, I only deliver it." June said nothing, just turned her eyes toward the distant hills, where Riverview Ranch waited, and where no one else was going. But she would. June didn't ask for directions. She didn't ask who had last seen Silas Reed, or why no one had taken down the wanted poster stapled to the post outside the Mercantile. She didn't ask because deep down, she already knew. If he was guilty, she would have to learn to live with that. And if he wasn't, well, the truth would come when it came. She stepped off the main street and began walking toward Riverview Ranch. The case in her hand was heavier than it had felt that morning. Or maybe she just hadn't noticed the weight until everything else had started to sink. The postman had tried to say something else, about how Silas wasn't a bad man, how things weren't always what they seemed. But June had already turned away. She didn't need apologies or vague warnings. She needed answers. And if she couldn't find them in town, she'd find them where the letters had come from, the ranch. It was a half-day walk under a flat sun. The wagon road twisted through dry grass and brittle fence lines. No horses, no cattle, just the wind and a few vultures circling something unseen. She kept going. The first thing she saw was the barn. It sagged to one side like it was too tired to stand. The paint had long since peeled away, revealing gray wood with veins like old hands. The house came into view a moment later, a simple 2-room structure with one shutter swinging open, caught in the breeze. June stopped at the gate. The sign was still there. Riverview Ranch carved in bold letters. But no one was watching the view now. No smoke from the chimney, no dogs barking, no boots on the porch. The silence was thick, broken only by the wooden creak of the porch swing, shifting in the breeze. She didn't hesitate. She opened the gate. The latch was stiff. She had to push hard to make it give. And when she did, the sound echoed like a challenge into the empty yard. She crossed the distance with steady steps. When she reached the door, she paused only long enough to knock once. Out of habit, not expectation. Then she turned the knob and walked inside. The air smelled of dust and disuse. The kitchen table still had a cup on it, dry and empty. A coat hung by the door. One boot was missing its pair. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs. Just a house frozen in the middle of someone leaving and never coming back. She set her suitcase down beside the table and walked to the window. The curtains were thin, and the fabric had been eaten at the corners by moths. Outside, the barn doors hung open. Tools leaned against the wall, untouched. The troughs were dry. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The view was what the ranch was named for, a long stretch of low hills rolling toward the horizon, golden, wind-tossed and wide. A place meant for someone to build something in, or to escape to, maybe both. She took a breath, and then, with sleeves rolled up and jaw set, she walked back inside. She had work to do. But first she stood still, one hand on the door frame, the other brushing the windowsill, coated thick with time and forgetfulness. The silence in the house wasn't hostile, it was waiting, and she knew somehow that if she didn't move soon, it would consume her too. So she started with the dust. She swept the floors like she was chasing ghosts out of hiding, beat the rugs until her arms ached, opened every window like it might let some of her own breath out too. Found a well out back, barely usable, but deep enough to bring up a bucket of clean water. She boiled it, scrubbed the table, and stacked the dishes she found under the sink. There was no pantry to speak of, but she located a small bag of flour, some stale oats, and a can of peaches. Enough for a day or two. In a chest under the bed, she found more than she expected. 3 shirts, 2 clean blankets, and a stack of letters. Not hers. These were older, folded carefully, addressed to names she didn't recognize. Some were unopened, some were creased with heavy wear. She didn't read them. She closed the chest, returned the blanket to the bed, and went back outside. By evening, the house no longer smelled empty. She lit the old stove, made a thin soup with what little she had, and sat on the porch with the bowl in her lap. The sun dropped fast, leaving a chill that crept up her arms. She didn't have a coat, but she didn't go inside. Not yet. She sat until the sky turned to ash and the coyotes began to call. And then finally she whispered aloud for the first time since arriving, "You should have been here." She didn't know if she meant it in anger or grief, but it was true either way. That night she slept in the bed that wasn't hers, in the house that didn't belong to her, waiting for a man who might never return. But she didn't feel like a guest. She didn't feel like someone passing through. She felt like someone who had arrived, and that somehow was enough. June woke before the sun crested the hills, her body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress, her arms aching from the previous day's labor. She didn't lie there and wait for warmth or clarity. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, pulled on her boots, and started the day like someone who had been doing it alone for years. In truth, it had only been 4 days since she arrived at Riverview Ranch. But time bends when you're the only voice in a place. She fetched water from the well again, 2 buckets this time. The rope on the pulley had frayed further overnight, and she made a note to ask for new cord the next time she dared return to town. She boiled 1 bucket for cleaning and the other for drinking. While the stove groaned to life, she swept the porch, tied back the limp curtains, and checked on the coop. Only 1 chicken had survived, a mean old hen with missing feathers and a temper to match. It eyed June warily as she scattered crumbs from a stale biscuit into the dirt. "You're not much," she said, "but you're not dead. That's something." By mid-morning, she had patched the gap in the back fence, using a rusted hammer and nails she'd scavenged from a collapsed woodpile. She hadn't asked permission. There was no one to give it, but she still spoke aloud while she worked, narrating her actions like someone might be listening anyway. "Reckon this'll hold for now, least until the wind remembers how to behave." Sweat dampened the back of her neck. Dirt streaked her arms and skirt. She didn't stop. Not when the hammer split, not when her fingers bled, not even when the vultures circled low again, reminding her she was still alone on this land and no one was watching but the sky. That afternoon, she walked the perimeter of the property. It took nearly 2 hours, not because the land was large. It wasn't, but because she kept stopping. There were boot prints near the north fence that didn't match hers. Too large, too fresh. A cigarette butt, too. She didn't smoke. Silas might have, but he wasn't supposed to be here. She crouched and touched the disturbed soil, heart beating faster than she'd allow her face to show. Then she stood, turned, and walked back to the house like nothing had happened. Inside, she checked the rifle above the mantel. Unloaded, no ammunition. She found 2 bullets in the kitchen drawer beneath a bent fork and a spool of thread. She loaded them slowly, not because she expected danger, but because it was worse not to be ready. She slept that night with the rifle beside the bed. She didn't expect sleep to come, and when it did, it came thin and broken, like a fence missing too many boards. The house creaked in places it hadn't before. Wind touched the windows like a stranger trying to knock without making a sound. At one point, she sat up. Not because of noise, because silence had gotten too loud. She reached out and touched the rifle again, just to make sure it was still there, just to remind herself that she still was too. She closed her eyes again, one open, no dreams. The next morning, the postman returned. He didn't come all the way to the porch, just stopped by the gate and tipped his hat like he knew how far was too far. "Morning, miss," he called. June came out with her sleeves rolled and a kitchen towel in one hand. "Morning. I figured I ought to check in. Word spread that you're still here." "I live here," she said. He hesitated. "You sure you want that to be true?" June didn't blink. "I'm not waiting on Silas. I'm building what he left behind." The postman scratched his cheek. I don't know what he did or didn't do. I just know people say things. Let them. He seemed relieved by her steadiness, or afraid of it. She couldn't tell. Before he left, he pulled something from his satchel. A small bundle of letters, some unopened. Found these in the back office, he said. Some look like his hand. She took them without flinching. Thank you. When he was gone, she sat at the table and spread the letters out. Only 2 had her name on them. The rest were addressed to others. Business partners, a sister in Missouri, a name she didn't recognize but suspected was a former partner in whatever dealings had led to that wanted poster. She opened the first letter slowly. Silas's handwriting was neat, upright, his words careful. He wrote about the ranch needing work, about building a life, about wanting someone who would stay even if things weren't easy. She folded it back into the envelope and didn't touch the second one. Not yet. 3 days passed before another soul came up the road. This time a woman, older, rigid, wrapped in a bonnet and a black shawl like she was attending a funeral. You June? She asked from atop a creaky wagon. I am. I'm Edna. I run the mercantile. Heard you came for Silas. I came for the life he promised, June said, but I'm staying for the one I'm building. Edna studied her, expression unreadable. Then she lifted a small bag from the wagon bed and set it on the gatepost. Flour? On credit. Don't make me regret it. June gave a polite nod. I won't. When Edna left, June watched the dust settle on the road behind her, and for the first time she felt something close to permission. She used the flour that night to bake flatbread. It didn't rise, but it filled her. And that was all she needed. Word traveled fast in towns like Riverview. The following afternoon, she walked into town with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back in a scarf. The mercantile was half full. Edna greeted her with a glance. 2 women by the sugar barrel fell silent as she passed. Mail order bride, one of them whispered, and he's a criminal. June didn't stop walking. She didn't react. She simply picked up a spool of twine, a tin of coffee, and a box of nails. She set them on the counter and counted out her coins slowly, precisely. As she turned to leave, she paused. Then clearly and calmly she said, I may have come here with a letter, but I'm not waiting on a man to give me a name. The store was silent. Edna didn't flinch. The other women looked away. She walked out taller than she'd walked in. That night someone left a note wedged under the barn door. No envelope, no name. Just 5 words. He's not coming back, girl. June read it once, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her journal between pages smeared with dirt and penciled inventory. Then she walked to the field, stood beneath the moon, and whispered, He doesn't need to. The wind stirred the tall grass. Something rustled beyond the ridge. She didn't move. She just stood there, rifle across her chest, boots planted in soil she'd begun to believe might one day be hers. And for the first time since arriving, she smiled. The air that morning smelled of sage and old rain. Not because it had rained, Lord knew it hadn't in weeks, but because the sky finally looked like it remembered how. Gray clouds tugged across the ridge, low and mean, promising something they might not deliver. June stood by the paddock with a tin cup in her hand, staring into the wind like it had answers. The chicken, still alive and still angry, scratched near her boots. She'd started naming things, even if she never said the names aloud. The chicken was Commander. The old maple by the well was Elias. The shovel with the cracked handle was Missouri, after the place she'd left behind and never meant to see again. Naming was dangerous. Naming meant staying, and staying meant hope. She turned back toward the house, stepped up onto the porch just as a shape moved along the distant trail. A rider, alone. He didn't come fast, didn't wear the urgency of someone running from something, but not the confidence of someone invited either. June watched, unmoving, as the rider approached, slow and deliberate, his horse dark and tall beneath him. He wore a long coat, weather-worn and dust-coated, and a wide hat that shaded his face until he was nearly at the gate. He dismounted without speaking, didn't tie the horse, didn't call out. But he looked straight at her and said, quiet and clear, "You're June." Her hand found the edge of the doorframe. "You're trespassing." "I could be," he replied. She narrowed her eyes. You know Silas. He took off his hat then. His face was younger than she expected. 30, maybe less. But there was something in his eyes that made age hard to measure. I knew him. Knew. He paused. Still do. Sort of. She didn't move from the porch. What does that mean? It means he's not dead. Not yet. But he might be if you don't listen to what I came to say. The words didn't hit like a threat. They landed more like a warning. Still, she didn't flinch. I'm listening. He stepped forward, just enough for her to see the faint scar under his jaw. My name's Emery. I rode with Silas back when he had a crew. Her breath caught. You're an outlaw. No, ma'am, not anymore. I got smart. Silas didn't. Then why are you here? He took a breath. To tell you something I probably shouldn't. June didn't speak. Just let the wind fill the silence. He didn't rob that bank. I know. You think you know, Emery said, but I mean it. He took the fall for someone, and now he's rotting in a cell while the real bastard's still drinking whiskey with his boots on a porch like this one. June crossed her arms. Why are you telling me? Emery hesitated. Because Silas wrote me. Said if he didn't make it, I should come out here. Make sure you were okay. She didn't move from the threshold, just looked at him a long moment. Then finally, you're not here to hurt me. It wasn't a question, it was a decision. He shook his head once, solemn. No, ma'am, I'm not. She turned, opened the door wider. You can eat, but you don't stay. That's fair. Inside, the house was quiet, not empty, just holding its breath. June set a plate on the table without ceremony. No extra fork, no apology for the chipped cup. Just food, just heat, just a place to sit. Emery ate like a man who knew the value of silence, and June watched him like someone deciding if a man could carry truth without setting it down. Poured coffee into a chipped cup. Emery ate like someone used to silence, and she let him. When he finished, he stood, thanked her, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he said, You're stronger than he ever told me. She met his eyes. He doesn't know the half of it. Then he was gone. June stood there a long time, the pouch still heavy in her hand. She unfolded the note. It was short. If you're reading this, it means I failed. But if you're still there, then maybe I didn't. I never deserved you. But I hoped you'd come anyway. And if I ever get out, I'll come back the long way, so I'm worth arriving for. SR. She folded it again, placed it in the same drawer as the rest. Then she walked outside back to the fence. The wind had picked up again, but this time it didn't chill her. It carried, and she stood straighter against it than ever before, because now she knew. She hadn't come for a man. She had come for a future, and no matter what happened next, it would not find her waiting. June didn't tell anyone that a stranger had come to the ranch. She didn't mention the ring, or the note, or the name Emery had spoken in that low, even voice that sounded more like confession than warning. She folded the memory into her spine and carried it the way she carried everything else, alone, upright, and without complaint. The day after Emery left, the wind shifted. It wasn't the kind that stirred curtains or rattled shutters. It moved slower, heavier, full of something that made her stop mid-task and lift her head, listening for a sound that hadn't yet arrived. The chickens were quiet. Even Commander. The clouds crawled in from the west like they'd been summoned. June was digging a row for carrots when she heard the wagon. Not a gallop, not a threat, just the steady rhythm of wooden wheels against dry earth. She stood, wiping her hands on her skirt, and waited. The wagon came into view. Edna's again. This time with sacks in the back and a boy perched beside her, no older than 10, holding a box in his lap like it might bite. Morning, Edna called, stopping short of the gate. June nodded. Everything all right? Edna pointed to the box. Got chicks. Hatchlings. Found 'em cheap from a fella east of Copper Run. Thought you might want some. June blinked. She stepped forward and looked at the boy, who opened the lid slightly to reveal a puff of yellow movement and soft, urgent peeping. I don't have a proper coop yet, she said. Edna shrugged. Didn't say you needed one. Just said maybe the place needed more noise. June smiled despite herself. She took the box gently from the boy, who watched her like she was something halfway between outlaw and legend. Edna added, "Also brought rope and feed. You'll pay me when you can." June swallowed the words forming in her throat. "Why?" Edna tilted her head. "Because you stayed." The wagon rolled off without another word. That night, June sat on the porch with a chick asleep in the crook of her arm, and the wind lifting her hair like it had a right to touch her now. She watched the horizon darken with slow rain and whispered, "Silas, if you ever come home, you might not recognize the place." She didn't mean the land. She meant herself. 3 days later, a girl from town showed up with a question about canning tomatoes. June didn't know the answer, but she figured they'd learn together. 1 week after that, the pastor's wife came with a jar of lard and a note that said, "They say you've made something grow out there. I'd like to see it." June let her in. They talked for hours about bread and bees and how sometimes the land listens better than people do. The woman left with 2 carrots and a promise to return. June didn't say it aloud, but in her heart she knew. She wasn't a guest anymore. She belonged. Then the wind changed again, not in direction, but in purpose. It carried with it the thump of hooves. 3 horses, 3 riders. June stepped off the porch before the dust even settled. They came like a storm that hadn't made up its mind yet. Not fast, but full of tension. 3 riders, 3 shadows against the ridge, dust curling around their boots even before they dismounted. Except they didn't. They just sat there, watching her. The middle one, tall, pressed coat, silver belt buckle that didn't belong to work, tipped his hat like it was a weapon, not a courtesy. "You June?" he asked, voice slick and easy, like he thought the name might shrink when spoken aloud. She didn't step back, didn't lower her gaze. She just folded her arms and let the silence tighten between them. "We heard you were waiting on a man, Silas Reed." "Nothing about his tone," said neighbor. He looked past her to the porch swing, the tools by the fence, the neat rows in the garden, and that's when June understood. They weren't just there to ask questions. They were there to remind her who wasn't supposed to survive out here alone. She nodded. "We heard you were waiting on a man, Silas Reed." She didn't respond. "We just came from Dobbs Hollow. Word is, he's up for sentencing soon. But see, the thing is," he leaned slightly forward, "some folks think he might walk." June held his gaze. "And?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That'd be inconvenient for some of us." "Who's us?" He shrugged. "People with investments." June didn't flinch. "People with guilt?" The man's jaw tightened. "You keep that mouth sharp, and someone's gonna dull it for you." June stepped off the porch fully. Then they better come with more than a warning and dust on their boots. For a long beat, no one moved. Then one of the riders spit to the side. The lead man grunted. "Just letting you know the winds are shifting, miss." She didn't break eye contact. "Then I'll plant deeper." They rode off without another word. June watched them go until the sound of hooves faded into the hills. Then she turned back to the house, her heartbeat steady. She knew now. They weren't just afraid Silas would speak. They were afraid someone like her had stayed and built and lasted. That night, the wind carried rain. The roof leaked. She placed a bucket under the drip and sat beside it with her sewing. The chicks chirped softly in the next room. Commander slept on the hearth like she owned the place. And June, with a mug of bitter tea and the rifle leaned against the wall, let herself feel something she hadn't felt in months. Readiness, not for a fight, not for a storm, but for him, for Silas. If he came back, if he found his way, if justice bent in his favor. She'd be here, not waiting, just living. In the place he'd once promised, in the life she'd claimed, in a name she was no longer borrowing. The sun had just begun to slide behind the western ridge when June heard it. A sound that didn't belong to wind or chicken or the daily thump of her own boots on dry earth. It was hooves, not fast, not panicked, just steady. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, not rushing, not bracing, just opening herself to whatever the evening brought. The horse came into view around the edge of the barn. The rider didn't wear a badge, didn't wear shame either. He wore road dust and time and a gray shirt that once might have been blue, and when he saw her, He stopped. Completely. She didn't move. Not at first. Her hands, still dusted with flour from that morning's bread, hung motionless by her sides. The man in front of her looked like the photograph once folded in her suitcase, but also nothing like it. Thinner, older in the eyes, wearing miles and mistakes like layers no coat could cover. He didn't smile, didn't run to her, just stood there, hat in hand, like maybe the porch was a church and she was the confession. And still, she didn't speak, because the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of the life she had built without him. He dismounted like a man not sure if the ground would still know his weight. And when he removed his hat, she saw it in his face. Not guilt, not fear, but ache, deep and quiet, like something that had been walking too long without water. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd still be you," she replied. Silas's eyes dropped for a moment, then rose again. "I read every letter you sent." "I only sent 2. He nodded. "I memorized both." A silence settled between them, as real and solid as the earth beneath their feet. June crossed her arms. "What did they do to you?" "They let me go," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked past her for a second, toward the porch, toward the house. Her house now. "They took time," he said finally. "More than they had a right to." June nodded. "I took it back," she said. He looked at her sharply then. "What?" "This place. I took it back. From dust. From silence. From them. You left a name here. I made it a life." He stepped forward slowly. "June, I'm not the man I promised to be. I'm not the woman you wrote to." The words met in the air between them, full of truth, but not bitterness. He took another step. "You built all this." She nodded. "With the postman and the merchant's wife and a chicken named Commander, and no help from ghosts." He laughed softly, and then he went quiet. "Do I have a place in it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past him, toward the barn. He followed. Inside, she pointed to the stall she'd cleared weeks ago. A rope, a brush, a place to lay. "It's not much," she said, "but it's clean, and you'll earn the rest." Silas set his bag down slowly. "I didn't come for comfort," he said. "I didn't build it for comfort," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he saw not a bride, not a woman waiting, but someone who had chosen herself, and somehow that made him love her more. They didn't speak much that first evening. June made cornbread. Silas repaired the hinge on the back door. At dusk, he stood on the porch and watched the hills while she read by lamplight. And when he finally stepped back inside, he said quietly, "I left as one man. I've come back as another." She turned a page. "That's good," she said, "because the man who left didn't leave a place for me." He stepped closer. "I'd like to." June looked up. "Then don't promise it." He stilled. "Just show me." They slept in separate rooms. Not from fear, but from honesty. She needed to know that he'd walk beside her without asking her to shrink. And he needed to know that being needed was not the same as being wanted. The next morning, June found him in the garden, hands in the dirt, back to the rising sun. She brought him a cup of coffee and didn't say a word. He took it, brushed the soil from his fingers, and smiled. It was small, but it was real. And in that smile, she saw something she hadn't expected. A beginning that didn't come from a letter, but from the long road home. Silas didn't ask to take the reins. He rose before the sun, hauled water, repaired fence posts, and kept mostly to the edges of June's rhythm. He didn't touch her letters, didn't question the new layout of the kitchen, and didn't ask why there was a soft whistle nailed to the barn post marked Commander. He just did what needed doing. And June watched, not closely, not with suspicion, but with that quiet attention of someone who had learned long ago that words meant less than actions. She watched how he rubbed the horse's shoulder before saddling, how he paused at the garden gate each morning like it deserved respect, how he never tried to open her door unless she opened it first. And slowly, almost invisibly, the air changed again. Not like wind, like breath. The ranch began to speak differently. The porch groaned less at night. The hens laid more regularly. Even the soil seemed looser under her hands, like it too had stopped bracing for abandonment. The townspeople changed too. Edna started sending over extra sacks of flour without saying why. The pastor's wife dropped by with a note asking if June would consider helping teach the younger girls how to hold their ground. Even the girl from before, the one who asked about canning, returned not for tomatoes but to ask, "Is he really him?" June smiled softly. "He is, and he isn't." The girl tilted her head. "Is that good?" June looked out at the yard, where Silas knelt beside a fence post, hands deep in dirt. "It's enough." One evening, June stepped onto the porch and found a small package resting on the swing. No name, no note. Inside, a silver-handled hairbrush and a pair of gloves, neither expensive, but both well-made. She didn't need to ask who left them. She set them on the table and sat in the swing, letting it rock gently. Silas came up the steps a few minutes later, sweat on his brow, eyes cautious. "You saw?" "I did," he nodded. "I don't expect anything." "I know." He looked down. "But I want everything." She let the swing slow, then said quietly, "I spent months building something out of silence, out of wood and water and wind, something strong enough to carry me whether or not you ever came back." He met her gaze. "I see it," she nodded. "And if you're going to be here, you don't need to lead it." He didn't flinch. "I'll follow." She watched him for a moment. Then, without fanfare, she reached out her hand. He took it, and they stayed that way. No kiss, no vow, just hand in hand, in the home she'd built with no guarantee. Later that month, the rains returned, not in violent bursts, but soft, soaking waves that made the hills glow green again. June planted lavender along the fence line. Silas built a bench under the maple tree. They didn't speak much while they worked, but that was all right, because the silences between them were no longer full of absence. They were full of presence. In town, people stopped calling her the mail-order bride. She became Miss June of Riverview. And Silas? He became the man who knew how to listen. One evening, as dusk painted the sky with fire, Silas came in holding something behind his back. She was kneading bread. He said, "Got a question?" She didn't stop working the dough. "Go on then." He pulled a simple ring from behind his back. Old silver. Familiar. "Will you marry me?" She looked up, wiped her hands on a cloth, stepped around the counter, took the ring, and said, "You're already home." Then she kissed him. Not like a promise, but like a choice. Some folks say stories like theirs are quiet ones. Not much noise, no guns drawn, no wild rides. Just two people standing still long enough to know they weren't running anymore. And maybe that's what real stories are. Not ones we hear, but ones we stay to live, together. Some stories arrive with thunder, others unfold like sunrise, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore once they begin to warm you. June didn't come to Riverview to be rescued. She came expecting a man and found an empty ranch. She came with a suitcase and found silence. But instead of turning back, she stayed. She planted things that had no reason to grow. She answered doors that weren't knocked on. And when a man finally came down the road, he didn't save her. He simply found a place she'd already saved for herself. Silas didn't return to a woman waiting in shadow. He returned to a woman standing in the light of a life she'd built without him, and still made room for him in it. Maybe you've been June. Maybe you built something out of what someone else left behind. Maybe you've been Silas, trying to come home not to a person, but to the best version of yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you believe, like we do, that love isn't something loud. It's something that shows up, every day, in work boots and worn hands and borrowed silence. So tell us, what part of June's journey made you stop and feel? When did Silas earn his place back? And have you ever built a life that someone else could walk into without asking you to move aside? We'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment. Share this with someone who understands quiet love. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones whispered between two people who stayed. The train hissed to a halt under a sky bleached with cold light, steam curling around the iron tracks like ghost breath. Clara Whitfield stepped off the last car with her chin lifted, coat buttoned high, and a worn suitcase in hand. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, her shadow long on the cracked wooden platform of Ironwood Hollow. Back in Illinois, folks had called her too much. Too tall, too direct, too proud. But she hadn't come all this way to be small. She came for a promise. For 6 months, she'd exchanged letters with a man named Thomas Avery, a sawmill foreman with neat handwriting and talk of steady income, quiet nights, and room to build a life. He never asked about her height. She never mentioned it. She'd hoped maybe that meant it didn't matter. But the man who stepped forward now, coat too fine, eyes already narrowing, spoke before she'd even reached him. "You're not what I pictured." Clara extended her hand, calm. "Mr. Avery?" He hesitated, shook it like it burned. "You didn't say you were so tall." "I didn't think it mattered." He looked away. "A wife ought to look up to her husband." Clara said nothing, just stood straighter. "I'll book your return fare," he muttered. "This won't work." And just like that, he was gone. She didn't chase him. She didn't cry. But her suitcase felt heavier as she walked through town alone, boots crunching into the frost-bitten dirt. Then a voice behind her, low and steady. "You're not lost, just not where you're meant to be yet." She turned. A man stood near the edge of the pines, axe slung over one shoulder, beard thick, coat worn. He was taller than her, broader too. His eyes were soft, not sorry. "Name's Reed Ashford," he said. "Lumber camp's just north of here. We don't measure people by inches. You need a place to warm up?" Clara hesitated, then nodded, because for the first time since stepping off that train, someone had seen her and not flinched. And that was enough to take the next step. The warmth hit Clara like a memory. Inside Martha Sloane's boarding house, the air smelled of wood smoke, fresh bread, and something faintly floral. The parlor was small, the rug worn, and the rocking chair by the hearth creaked like it had stories of its own. But after the wind-whipped platform of Ironwood Hollow, it felt like stepping into a kindness she hadn't expected. "Room's upstairs," Martha said, brushing her hands on her apron. "Corner 1. Bed's firm. Water's hot enough if you don't dawdle." Clara nodded, her suitcase still in her grip. "Thank you. I'll pay what I can until I find work." Martha gave her a look. "You'll help where help's needed. That's payment enough for now." No pity, just practicality. Clara liked her instantly. The room was small but clean. A slanted ceiling, a single window facing the pines, and a patchwork quilt tucked neatly over the mattress. Clara set down her case and sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling for the first time in hours. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried on the train, or when Thomas Avery's face shifted from surprise to embarrassment to dismissal. She hadn't cried when the train pulled away behind her, taking the last of her old life with it. But here, in this quiet room, she let her shoulders fall. Not in defeat, just release. She was tired, and she was still standing. Later that evening, she helped Martha set the table for the boarders, 3 loggers and an elderly schoolteacher named Miss Ruth. "You'll need boots suited for this terrain," Ruth said gently, eyeing Clara's travel-worn pair. "These hills don't forgive light leather." Clara smiled faintly. "I'll make do." Reed Ashford arrived last, his hair wine-tossed, his sleeves rolled. He nodded to everyone and took the seat across from Clara without fanfare. He didn't stare, didn't speak much either. But when Martha served stew, he passed the bread to Clara first. A small thing, but it anchored her. After dinner, Reed offered to show her around town the next morning. "I've got business at the supply store anyway," he said simply. "If you're looking for work, you'll want to meet Mr. Caro. He owns most of what needs mending." Clara hesitated. "You don't have to." "Not doing it for you," he said, then added, "doing it because no one else will." She nearly smiled. The next day, the town looked different in daylight. Less like a rejection, more like something to be understood. Children ran between buildings, their laughter sharp in the cold. Men hauled timber down the muddy street, boots caked and backs bent. Women swept storefronts or strung laundry between clapboard walls. Every eye followed Clara as she walked beside Reed. No one said anything cruel, but silence can be sharp too. Reed didn't notice, or pretended not to. He spoke to the blacksmith, tipped his hat to the pastor, and held the mercantile door for Clara without looking at her like she was anything but a neighbor. Inside, Mr. Caro squinted at Clara over the top of his glasses. "You the new boarder?" "Yes," she said. "She's a skilled hand with needlework," Reed added. "Martha vouched for her." Caro hummed. "Might have some repairs come week's end. We'll see." He turned back to his ledger. Clara didn't push. She was used to earning space inch by inch. That evening, as she swept the boarding house steps, Martha handed her a thick wool coat. "My husband's," she said. "He passed 2 winters ago. Always said the cold couldn't touch him. Still caught pneumonia?" Clara took the coat carefully. It was heavy, well made, with deep pockets and a collar high enough to guard against the wind. "Thank you," she said. Martha waved it off. "Does no good in the closet." But Clara knew better. That was the kind of gift people gave when they wanted you to stay. By week's end, Clara had mended a pair of trousers for one of the boarders and helped Ruth organize books for the schoolhouse. The work was quiet. So was she. But each stitch, each polite nod from a townsfolk, each shared glance with Reed at dinner, built something in her. Not quite belonging, but the beginning of it. On Saturday, a boy from town brought a bundle to the boarding house. "Mr. Ashford says these need mending. Camp uniforms, ripped at the seams." Clara took the bundle in silence. Inside, she found flannel shirts, torn cuffs, patched knees. The scent of pine and smoke clung to the fabric. She worked late into the night, not because she had to, but because someone had trusted her with a task that mattered. Sunday morning, Martha set a plate aside at breakfast. "For Reed," she said. "He's out hauling before dawn most days." Clara didn't think before she said it. "I'll take it to him." The walk to the logging camp was uphill, the trail slick with old snow and fallen needles. The trees stretched tall overhead, their branches sharp against the pale sky. Reed was by the shed, splitting kindling. He looked up as she approached. "I brought you breakfast," she said, holding out the plate. He set down the axe, wiped his hands. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. He took the plate, his hand brushing hers. Rough, warm. "You finished those shirts already?" he asked. "All but one." He nodded. "Good work." They stood in silence, the forest around them humming with wind. Then Reed said, "Most folks don't last long here." Clara looked up at him, the morning sun catching the edge of her jaw. "I'm not most folks." And something in his gaze, steady, quiet, told her he already knew that. The first real snow came on a Wednesday. It wasn't a flurry, not a warning. It was the kind that blanketed roofs and swallowed fence lines, that hushed the whole of Ironwood Hollow into stillness. By mid-morning, the boarding house windows had fogged with breath and stew steam. Clara stood at the parlor window, watching the flakes fall thick and steady. She should have felt trapped, but somehow, she felt steadier than she had in months. That afternoon, Reed returned from the woods early, boots heavy with snow and jacket soaked through. He stomped into the back entryway, shaking off the cold like it had challenged him to a fight and lost. Martha looked up from the hearth. "There's stew on the stove, and dry shirts in the basket." Reed nodded once. "Much obliged." As he passed, Clara handed him a folded towel without a word. He took it. Their hands brushed. He paused, looked at her. "Thanks." She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. The next morning, the wind howled over the hills and the trees groaned under the weight of white. Clara bundled herself in Martha's late husband's coat and ventured outside to sweep the steps. The snow fought back. It piled faster than she could clear, but she kept going. Halfway through, a second shovel appeared beside her. She looked up. Reed. He didn't say anything, just started clearing beside her, moving in steady strokes, shoulder to shoulder. Together, they finished twice as fast. He nodded toward her boots. "You'll want better soles come January." She arched a brow. "I'll add it to the list." He smirked. "Just a little." At lunch, the loggers at the table joked about someone stealing Reed's breakfast that morning. One of them elbowed the other and said, "Maybe he's finally getting civil." Reed didn't look up from his stew, but when Clara refilled his coffee, he murmured, "Appreciate it." And that was enough. By week's end, a new bundle arrived at Clara's sewing table. No note, just shirts, flannel, torn elbows, a few bloodstains at the cuffs. She ran her fingers over the fabric, recognizing reeds among them. They were worn through but clean. Someone had tried to scrub them before bringing them in. She sewed late into the night, the fire crackling nearby. Each stitch felt like a conversation she didn't know how to start. Each mend, an answer she didn't know she was giving. Saturday afternoon, she walked the repaired bundle up to the logging shed. Reed was splitting logs again, steam rising from his collar. He looked up when she approached. Quicker than expected. "You weren't exactly gentle with them," she said, handing over the folded shirts. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. "Come inside," he said finally. "Out of the wind." She followed him into the work cabin, where the scent of pine sap and cold iron filled the air. A small stove crackled in the corner. Tools hung from the walls. It wasn't warm, but it was protected. He poured her coffee from a dented tin pot. No sugar, no apology. Clara sipped and nodded. "You do this for all the women who fix your sleeves? You're the first to fix them right." They stood in silence. Not tense, not awkward, just mutual. Then he said, "I was raised by a woman who never said thank you out loud." Clara looked over at him. "But you always knew when she meant it," he added. Clara met his eyes. "And you?" "I try to mean things more than I say them," she smiled. "I'm starting to understand that about you." The next morning, Martha caught Clara in the kitchen, buttering bread. "You two are quiet as snowfall," she said. "But folks are starting to notice." Clara paused. "Notice what?" "That you don't stoop around him." Clara blinked. "He doesn't make you feel like you have to," Martha added. "No," Clara said softly. "He doesn't." That evening, Reed knocked gently on the sewing room door. She looked up from her stitches. "Yes?" He stepped inside, holding something wrapped in linen. "I made this," he said. "Won't win any ribbons." He unwrapped it. A small wooden carving, a pine cone. Rough around the edges, but delicate in the details. Real effort, real time. "For your table," he said, "since you've made it your own." Clara held it in her hands, the weight of it surprising. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, lingering a moment too long before stepping back into the hall. When he was gone, she set the pine cone on the shelf beside her thread spools. Not because it matched, but because it belonged. That night, as wind battered the windows and the trees moaned outside, Clara sat by the fire with her sewing and thought about the man from the pines. He hadn't asked for her name when they met. He hadn't asked for anything. But with every gesture, coffee, a carved gift, a shovel in the snow, he had offered something rare, space. And in return, without even realizing it, Clara had begun to offer something back. Trust. The snow didn't melt, but the town's silence did. It cracked, it shifted, and slowly it turned into something else. Not warmth, not welcome, just a new kind of watchfulness. It began at the Dry Pine Mercantile. Clara stepped inside to collect thread and buttons. The bell above the door gave a sharp ring, and every conversation inside paused for just a second too long. Mrs. Hill, the baker's wife, offered a smile that was all teeth. "Still staying on at Martha's?" "For now," Clara said, chin steady. "She must be fond of you. Or maybe she just sees worth where others don't." A few heads turned. Clara didn't flinch. She paid for her thread and walked out into the cold with her spine as straight as the needles in her sewing basket. That evening at supper, one of the loggers joked too loud. "You keep sewing shirts for Reed, folks'll start saying you're measuring more than fabric." The room laughed, except for Reed, who set his fork down with a thud. "You say that again," he said, voice low, "and you'll be finding your own tailor." "And your teeth." Silence fell like snow. The logger blinked. "Just teasing." Reed didn't smile. "Don't." Clara didn't say anything. She didn't have to, but her fingers curled tighter around her glass. The next Sunday, she walked to church alone. Martha had stayed back with a cough, and Reed didn't attend services, claiming he got enough reverence under pine trees. Inside, the pews were full. Eyes followed her up the aisle. She sat 2 rows from the front, alone. The sermon was about humility. The looks weren't. Afterward, in the vestibule, the whispers grew louder. "She's bold, isn't she? Doesn't even wear a bonnet." Walks like she owns the place. She's got plans for that lumberman. Just you watch. Clara didn't respond, but her ears burned, and her jaw tightened. Outside, as she walked toward the boarding house, boots crunching through new snow, someone called from behind her. William Avery, the man who'd promised her a future, then vanished before her boots hit the dirt. "Miss Whitfield," he said, all syrup and steel. "You've settled in nicely." She turned. "I've survived. Not that you noticed." He smiled, thin and sharp. "Oh, I notice everything, including the company you keep. Reed Ashford isn't exactly the most discerning sort." Clara held his gaze unmoved. "Maybe he doesn't judge a woman by her silhouette." Avery stepped closer, voice lowering. "You think you found your place here? But Ironwood Hollow doesn't take kindly to women who speak too loudly or stand too tall." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "And men like you don't take kindly to women who don't flinch." His expression darkened. "You've made a scene, Clara. Scenes have consequences." Clara's voice sliced through the chill. "Only for people who think silence is obedience." He took one final step forward, too close. "Don't mistake curiosity for respect," he said. "This town watches everything. Eventually it'll turn." She stepped past him, slow and sure. "Then let it. I'll still be standing when it does." And she didn't look back. That night, Reed found her in the sewing room, fingers tight around a hem that had gone crooked. "Something wrong with the fabric?" he asked. "No," she said. "With the people." He waited. "They think I'm too loud, too proud, too much." Reed leaned against the doorframe. "Are you?" She looked up. "Do you think I am?" He didn't answer immediately. He crossed the room, lifted the hem from her hands, and examined the stitch. "Straight," he said. "Firm." Then he looked at her. "So are you." Clara swallowed hard. He added, "Some folks only feel tall when they're making someone else feel small." She breathed just once. "Thank you." He didn't smile. He just placed the fabric back in her lap. And that was enough. The next day, a small package arrived at the boarding house. A pair of gloves, wool-lined, handmade. Too large for most women, just right for Clara. There was no note, but when she looked out the window, she saw Reed loading logs into the cart, one glove missing. She smiled, and wore them that night to supper. Let them whisper. She had work to do, hands to keep warm, and a man who knew her size, not as a flaw, but as a fact. By Thursday, another seam tore, but this time it wasn't cloth, it was perception. Mrs. Blythe, town widow, matron of opinion, knocked on the boarding house door mid-morning, clutching a dress in her arms. "I need it let out," she said. "Too much pie, too little walking." Clara took the dress gently. "No shame in that." Mrs. Blythe studied her. "You're not like your letters said." "I didn't write letters," Clara replied. Number. "But I heard plenty about you." A pause. "But I also see a woman who works hard, minds her business, and fixes what's broken." Clara waited. Mrs. Blythe nodded once. "You'll do," and left. Later that evening, Reed knocked on her door. "I heard what happened," he said. "At church." With Avery, Clara looked up. "He's not worth discussing." "No," Reed said. "But you are." She blinked. He stepped closer. "You don't owe anyone silence." "Sometimes silence is safer." "Not always," he said. "Sometimes it just lets the wrong people speak louder." She stood, taller than him, almost, but he didn't flinch. He never had. "You're not a problem to solve, Clara," he said quietly. "You're a presence, one I'd rather have beside me than behind." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply reached for the spool of thread on the windowsill and pressed it into his hand. "If you're going to keep tearing seams," she said, "you'd better start learning how to fix them." He smiled barely, but it was there. And in that moment, the whispers of a town held less weight than the silence between them. The wind shifted before the snow did. Reed had said it that morning with his usual quiet certainty, sipping his coffee while the clouds rolled in low and gray. "Storm's coming," he'd murmured. He still went to the camp. Of course he did. There was timber stacked uneven at the northern ridge, and no one else knew how to brace it before the freeze set in. He left before dawn, coat drawn tight, axe slung across his shoulder. Clara stood at the doorway as he disappeared into the trees, something uneasy stirring in her chest. She didn't know yet that she'd be counting the hours by the tilt of the light, the depth of the silence, and the way no one had returned by sundown. The storm hit fast. Heavy snow, thick as wool, drifted down in sheets, blanketing roofs and swallowing sound. By mid-afternoon, the loggers at the camp had staggered back down the trail in twos and threes, soaked, silent. No Reed. Clara was in the parlor when the door burst open. A young man, barely old enough to shave, stood panting on the rug, his coat stiff with ice. "He's hurt," he said. "Mr. Ashford. Tree cracked wrong. Pinned his leg." Clara was already grabbing her scarf. Martha blocked the door. "Wait, where are you going?" "To get him. You'll never make it up the ridge in this storm." "He would." Martha opened her mouth, closed it, then stepped aside. "Take the lantern," she said quietly, "and don't be stupid with your bravery." The trail was nearly invisible, marked only by deep ruts and a few broken branches. Clara moved fast, one hand clutching the lantern, the other gripping a walking stick. The wind cut through her coat like knives. By the time she reached the camp, her cheeks were raw, her lungs burning. Inside the main cabin, Reed lay on a cot. Legs splinted with a crooked board, jaw clenched against the pain. He turned when he heard her. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "You shouldn't be stuck under a tree." She crossed the room and set down the lantern, her fingers already reaching for the bandages on the shelf. One of the loggers cleared his throat. "We weren't sure what else to do. Doc can't make it till morning." Clara nodded once. "I'll stay." They gave her space, as if everyone in the room understood that something more than injury was being tended to. She knelt beside Reed, pressing a warm cloth to his forehead. "You look worse than the tree," she said. He grunted. "You're a terrible nurse." "Lucky for you, I'm better with stitches than bedside manner." Reed's breath hitched as she tightened the splint, but he didn't complain. He just watched her. Eyes not glassy with fever, but with something else. Gratitude, or maybe something deeper. Night fell. The fire crackled low. Clara stayed at Reed's side, changing bandages, reading from the tattered book he kept by the bunk, feeding him broth when his hand trembled too much to hold the cup. At some point, he fell asleep, his breath evening out. Clara leaned back in the chair exhausted, but her heart was steady. She wasn't afraid, not of storms, not of snow, not of the way she felt with his hand resting near hers. Like maybe she'd stopped wandering. By morning, the worst had passed. Reed was lucid, sore, but stable. The storm had buried Ironwood Hollow in 3 feet of snow, but the sun had returned. When they finally helped him back down to the boarding house, 2 loggers holding him up like a makeshift sled team, Martha had already warmed blankets and cleared the parlor couch. Clara fluffed the pillow. "You didn't have to do all this," Reed said, jaw tight. She looked him in the eyes. "Yes," she said, "I did." The first night back, he barely slept. Pain, restlessness, the weight of stillness. It all gnawed at him. Clara sat across from him, sewing in the lamplight. "You should rest," he muttered. "You first." He shifted, winced, then looked at her. "You're not afraid of the mess, are you?" Clara's needle paused. "I've been called messier things." "That's not what I meant." She met his gaze, serious now. "No," she said. "I'm not afraid." "You could have walked away. Everyone else would have." "I'm not everyone else." That made him quiet. Then with surprising softness, he asked, "Do you ever feel small?" She let out a breath, part laugh, part disbelief. "I've spent my whole life being told to be smaller, quieter, less visible. And now?" Clara didn't answer. She just reached forward and gently took his hand in hers. It was the first time she'd done it without needing an excuse. No tea, no bandage, no shirt to mend. Just her hand in his. He didn't pull away. He squeezed once. That was all. But it was everything. Outside, the snow settled. Inside, something else did too. Not love, not yet, but something warm, something rooted. The kind of thing that doesn't burn bright and fast, but holds steady through storms. It began with a letter. Martha found it tucked in the folds of the morning paper, its seal heavy with red wax and a faint scent of pine tar. She passed it to Reed, who lay stretched out on the parlor couch, legs still stiff beneath a quilt Clara had stitched for him. Reed read it once, then again, then looked at Clara. "They're holding the town vote in 3 days," he said, "on the logging rights to the Southern Tract. Avery's pushing hard for expansion." Clara folded the laundry beside the stove. "And you?" "I've already said my piece, but I need to be there." She paused. "Can you?" Reed shifted, wincing. "I can stand." Clara gave him a look. "But can you stand up?" He met her eyes and nodded. The next day, the town began to buzz. Avery's supporters passed out flyers, promises of profit, of progress. He shook hands at the general store, spoke grandly at the post office, smiled too widely at anyone who hesitated. Clara watched from the boardwalk. Every time Avery caught her gaze, his smile turned tight. Like he knew, like he remembered. That night, the parlor filled with quiet tension. Reed sipped broth from a mug, staring into the fire. "I don't know what kind of man Avery thinks I am," he said, "but I do know what kind of land he'll leave behind." Clara sat beside him, turning a button over in her hand. "You've spent your life building something steady," she said. "He wants to make something fast." Reed looked at her. "You'd speak at the meeting, wouldn't you?" She blinked. "Me? You've spoken clearer than I have since the day you arrived." Clara laughed once, a low, surprised sound. "I've been called many things, but never someone worth listening to." "You are now," he said. She didn't answer, but the next morning she wrote down what she needed to say, and for the first time in years her hands didn't tremble. On the night of the vote, Ironwood Hollow's town hall filled to bursting. Men with soot-stained hands, women in worn shawls, children clutching their parents' coats. Everyone came, not because they wanted to argue, but because deep down they all knew what was at stake. Avery stood at the front, trim and polished. Reed sat near the aisle, one crutch braced between his hands. And Clara? Clara stood, straight-backed, head high, dressed simple but strong. She stepped to the front of the room with no one introducing her, no nameplate, no invitation, just her voice. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said. "You may know me, or think you do." Whispers stirred. She let them. "I came here with a suitcase and a letter. I was supposed to marry a man who decided I wasn't the right size to fit his picture, so I stayed in spite of that." A few glances shifted, some downward, some apologetic. "I stayed because I saw something here, a town with history, with trees older than any of us, with people who work harder than they're ever thanked for. But lately, what I see are men trying to carve up the very thing that gives this place meaning." She turned to the council. "You don't have to know me. You just have to know this. Quick money will not make Ironwood Hollow stronger. It'll make it hollow for real. And once those trees are gone, so is everything that makes this place more than a dot on a map." She paused, let it land, then stepped aside, and Reed stood, with effort, with pain. But he stood. "The land doesn't belong to men like Avery," he said. "It belongs to those who plant roots, who stay, who build." Clara's chest ached with something proud. The crowd stirred, a few clapped, a few stood, and Judge Morris, old and tired and steady, nodded once. "We'll vote now." An hour later, the results were posted outside the hall. By a margin of 12 votes, the council ruled against Avery's expansion. The room erupted, some in protest, most in relief. Clara stood in the cold, unreadable, until Reed came up beside her and said, "You did it." She shook her head. "We did." And then, without hesitation, she reached for his hand. He took it. No questions, no permission. Just fingers laced together in the open air, in front of everyone who'd ever whispered. Avery passed them as he left the hall, coat stiff with frost and pride. He didn't look at her, but Clara didn't need him to. She was already looking ahead. Back at the boarding house, Martha poured 2 cups of cider and handed one to Clara with a satisfied grunt. "You scared them," she said. "Good," Clara replied. "They needed waking up." Reed sat on the couch, leg propped up, the beginnings of a smile tugging at his mouth. You're dangerous when you get going, he teased. Clara looked at him. You'd better get used to it. I plan to, he said, and the way he said it, plain, steady, sure, felt more like a promise than any letter ever could. That night, Clara lit a small oil lamp in her sewing room. She reached for her pattern book, flipped past the pages of designs, and tucked a folded flyer from the vote between the pages. A memory, not of a victory, but of a beginning, one she had helped shape, one she was ready to claim. The snow softened with each passing day, turning from ice-crusted mounds into heavy wet slush that soaked the boardwalks and darkened the pines. The town shifted with it, its pace slower, its voices warmer, as if winter had finally taken a breath. Clara no longer stooped beneath doorways. She no longer flinched at whispers. She no longer apologized, because somewhere between the storm and the vote, she had stopped surviving and started living. The boarding house felt different now. Reed's crutch leaned against the coat rack like a visiting friend. The parlor no longer felt like a sick room, but a place of shared silence and light. Clara still sewed in the back room, though now her mending was interrupted by neighbors who brought pie or children who came to fetch their father's patched overalls. And Reed? He was healing, slowly, stubbornly. He'd started walking without the crutch 3 days ago, just across the kitchen, just to reach the stove. But Clara had seen the way his hand brushed the doorframe for balance, and she had said nothing, because his pride was sacred, and so was her patience. One morning she found him outside, stacking wood with one hand and swearing under his breath. "You're pushing too hard," she called out from the porch. He looked up. "I've got a spine, not glass." "Spine's not much good if it's frozen solid," he smirked. "You always this bossy?" She stepped down the stairs. "Only when I care." That quieted him, in the way that mattered most. That evening he lingered in the sewing room. Clara stitched in the lamplight, her fingers working at a hem. Reed leaned in the doorway, watching her like she was a sunrise he'd never seen twice the same way. He spoke after a long pause. "I've been carving again." She looked up. "I remember the pine cone." He held something out in both hands. A small wooden figure. A woman, tall and straight, carved with rough reverence. Her hands weren't dainty. Her frame wasn't small. She wasn't soft, but she was strong. She was real. "She's not perfect," he said. "She's perfect to me." Clara took it gently and held it longer than she meant to. "Is this how you see me?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "It's how I remembered you, before I ever touched your hand." She set the figure on the shelf beside her threads. "Then it belongs here." He hesitated. "You could move it if you'd rather." "No," she said. "This room is mine, and she's a part of that now." She looked at him. "And so are you." 2 days later, the thaw fully arrived. Children ran muddy through the streets. Dogs barked with purpose again. The pine trees dripped. Life resumed. But for Clara, it wasn't a return. It was a beginning. That afternoon, Reed met her in the garden behind the boarding house. The ground was still hard but not frozen. He had a shovel. She had lilac roots she'd ordered weeks ago. "We plant these here?" he asked. "Unless you think I should take them somewhere else." He dug the first hole. She pressed the root down. Together they covered it with soil. Reed looked at her. "I want you to stay." Clara's breath caught, just slightly. "You've never asked me for anything," she said. He shifted, voice low. "Then let me ask now. Stay. For good. Not just at Martha's. Not just in Ironwood. With me." She turned to him fully. His hand still held dirt. His eyes didn't waver. "I'm not a man of speeches," he said, "but I've got a table with 2 chairs, a bed too big for one, and a name I'd give you if you asked." Clara stared at him, all the old walls rising, and then falling. "Say it plain," she whispered. "Be my home," he said, "and let me be yours." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. She stepped forward, took his hand, and laid it gently over the second lilac root. "I used to believe I had to shrink to fit into someone's life," Clara said softly. "But with you, I just grow." "Then let's grow something that lasts," she said. And the next morning she hung her coat beside his on the porch rail. For the first time, it didn't feel borrowed. It felt like hers. That night, Clara placed her things back into her trunk, not to leave, but to put them away. There was nothing left to prove, and nowhere else she'd rather be. A week later, the town gathered for spring planting. The festival was small: children with ribbons, women with baskets of seeds, music from a fiddle that squeaked on the high notes. Clara wore a simple cotton dress she had made herself. She didn't try to hide her height. She didn't need to. As she walked past the general store, Mrs. Blythe stopped her with a warm nod. "You're not what I expected," the older woman said. Clara smiled. "That's the point." Further down the road, a young girl looked up at her, eyes wide. "You're the lady who stood at the meeting." "I am." "You were brave." Clara knelt so they were eye level. "So are you. Don't let anyone tell you different." When she stood again, Reed was waiting at the edge of the square, a basket of seedlings in hand. They walked side by side, like they always had, like they always would. And as the sun dipped low behind the ironwood ridge, lighting the sky in golden fire, Clara looked up at the peaks, then over at Reed. "You once asked if I ever felt small," she said softly. "I remember." "I don't anymore." He reached for her hand. "Good. Because you were never meant to be. Not every woman fits the mold, and not every love story begins with a yes." Clara didn't wait to be chosen. She chose to stay, in silence, in storms, in her own strength. Tell us in the comments, what moment stayed with you the most? Have you ever been told you were too much? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing how far these stories reach. Maybe there's more to come. Tap like, subscribe, and share with someone who's learning to take up space.